Hi, City Manager Dave Dillner here with Citizens Academy. On this episode, we'll be talking about the capital project planning process. This will help you understand how a project goes from an idea all the way to construction. The first step in this process is strategic planning. Strategic planning is a process that the City Commission conducts that allows it to identify the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats facing the community. And then taking this information, it identifies the priorities that the Commission would like to focus on over the next few years. By doing this, the Commission is basically stating what it would like to allocate funds for in order to make progress in these priority areas. Once the strategic plan has been identified and defined, staff now has guidance on what projects to be looking for and developing as a means to help the Commission complete its strategic plan. Once the City Commission has completed the strategic planning process, we move to the next phase, which is the needs assessment phase. In the needs assessment phase, the city is going to look at current needs as well as potential future needs arising from either growth or some other catalyst that may be affecting the community. By anticipating the future needs, the idea is that we begin to think about projects that may be needed in the future that we can begin to either implement or design today to prepare for those circumstances. Another thing that we do in the needs assessment phase is we look at existing facilities to determine whether or not they meet our existing community's needs and desires. This will include things like our park facilities, our buildings, as well as our infrastructure that is needed to serve our community. For example, if we know that we are planning to grow into a certain area, we will look at the infrastructure within that area to determine what improvements might be needed to accommodate that growth. In some cases, it might be as easy as building a roadway to open up new area for residential development. But in other cases, it may be that our existing infrastructure is already at capacity. Now we would need to conduct a study or determine what types of infrastructure improvements would be needed in order to serve that area. Going back to our growth model, if we think about it in terms of, let's say a developer is going to come in and build 100 new homes. This is obviously a good problem to have, but it might be in an area where we lack water pressure in order to handle that new growth. So for example, we might need to study some options to determine how we would best serve that area, not only for a water pressure standpoint, but also for a fire flow and just general serviceability standards. By doing so, we now determine that we need to invest in a booster pump station that will provide the needed pressure to serve the area, as well as the fire flows needed for that residential development. Now we can begin to put that into the capital plan so that we can then make sure that that happens when that growth comes to our community. A needs assessment is very broad and encapsulates, again, current needs. What can we do today to make our infrastructure and our facilities better, but also looks at the future in terms of what do we think we're going to need in the future to accommodate future growth or to affect changes that we are anticipating coming down the road. The needs assessment process is also informed with community input. At various stages, the city may solicit community feedback through a variety of means, and by taking this input, we can then help identify the needs as seen through the lens of our citizens. This will help us determine where to best spend public resources. After the needs assessment phase, we then transition to the project prioritization phase. During the project prioritization phase, what we're going to do is we're going to take the list of needs that we've identified in the needs assessment phase, and we are going to evaluate those projects based on a list of criteria and prioritize them to determine how we are going to allocate public funds. When we evaluate these projects, we're going to be looking at a variety of different criteria to help us determine and assign values based on these criteria. For example, criteria that we might use to evaluate a project could include things like, does it address a public safety issue? Does it align with the Commission's strategic priorities? How does it affect or impact public health? Does it have a return on investment? Does it prepare the city for future economic development? Does it address equity issues within the community? Is it a project that will be sustainable over the life of the project, meaning will the city have enough money to maintain the asset, and will it generate revenue, and will that revenue be sufficient to continue the service or the project? These are just a few of the criteria that a community can use to evaluate all of its projects that it has to look at in terms of developing its capital plan. Each of these criteria will probably be assigned a value, and then a committee will be formed to then rank each of those projects using these criteria. Projects that receive higher rankings will percolate to the top of the list, while projects that don't receive as many points will go to the bottom. This is a great way of prioritizing projects, especially when these projects are competing for scarce funding resources. Once that prioritization has been done and the projects have been thoroughly evaluated, we now can transition to the next phase of our process, which is the financial analysis. It is in the financial analysis phase that we now take the estimated costs for these projects and we look at the city's ability to pay for the projects. Now, when we talk about capital projects, the city has a couple of means for paying for projects. The first means is cash financing, or if we have money in the bank that we can use to pay for projects, we can do that. Cash financing is oftentimes used for smaller projects or the initial phases of a project, such as feasibility studies or conceptual analyses. Cash financing can also be used for larger projects, provided that the fund that will be used to pay for the project has sufficient reserves on hand in compliance with city policies. The second method for financing projects is to bond the project. Bonding is basically borrowing money for a defined term or a defined period of time so that we can pay it off over that term. So an example of that was the city's General Obligation Bonding Authority. The city can issue general obligation bonds, which are backed by the full faith and credit of the city of El Dorado, to finance various projects. Oftentimes, the general obligation bonds are issued for 10 years or for 20 years, depending on the preference of the city and its policies. During that time, the city will make payments to pay down the bond. And then after the term is completed, the bond will be retired and the asset will be paid for. Major benefits of bonding a project versus cash financing is that we are able to stretch the payment over a longer duration of time. This means that the fund that is going to be paying for the project, for example, the water fund or the general fund, will not have to take a large one-time hit as in the case of cash financing. So we're able to stretch that out over a longer period of time. One of the downsides, however, is that by bonding, we have to pay interest on the project, which will actually increase the cost of the project as compared to cash financing. When we cash finance a project, our borrowing costs are zero, and so our interest cost is also zero. We might bond a project because we don't want that fund to take a large cash impact, but it also gives us the ability to invest our cash reserves and make a return on that investment as well. So there are pros and cons to both cash financing and bonding, and as part of the financial analysis phase, we're going to look at both cash financing and bonding to determine which method is going to be the best, not only for citizens and their funds, but also for the overall schedule of the city. One of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to line up all of our projects so as to minimize the need for any tax increases or utility rate increases that may be needed to fund the entire program. The idea being that we want to keep our revenues flat over a duration of time, say 5 years, and by doing so, we are able to fund those projects in an orderly and stable manner without any major shocks to ratepayers or taxpayers. This prudent management system allows us to do many projects and allows us to manage our cash in a way that is beneficial to the overall use of taxpayers' dollars. After we have completed the financial analysis phase, we then move to our budgeting and allocation phase. If we think about the capital plan as a 5-year plan, this is the phase where we're actually going to assign a project to a specific budget year within that 5-year plan. So a project could be assigned year number 1, or it could be assigned year number 3, or even year number 5, depending on when funds are available and when we have bonding capacity, if we're going to choose to issue bonds for that project. By doing it this way, we can then put the entire plan down on a piece of paper so that our public can then look at it and understand exactly when we're planning to do all of these projects. Now, let's break this up a little bit more. One project might actually extend over several years. The first phase of the project, for example, the conceptual phase, might be done in year number 1. Once that phase is completed, we would then move to an engineering or design phase, which could be done in year number 2. Once that's completed, we would then transition to construction phase, which may actually extend over multiple years depending on the size and scope of the project. So as you can see here, one project in and of itself can extend over several years during the capital improvement process. Now, if we think about it in terms of the overall program, we will then begin to understand that we have multiple projects going on at different phases throughout that entire 5-year schedule. What do I mean by this? Well, at any given calendar year, the city has several street projects, water line projects, sewer line projects, and other projects that are going on at the same time. All of these projects can be at different phases of their life cycle, as we've talked about in the capital project process video. And so by putting this into our plan, we do a couple of things. We put together a plan that allows staff and the commission to understand when projects are going to be done and how those dollars will need to be allocated. And we also have a plan to communicate to the public so they know when a project is going to be done. A lot of times the public will say, well, I don't understand why work is not being done on that project. Well, a lot of times that's because a project is already been authorized, but is currently in a design phase where most of the work is taking place behind the scenes by engineers in an office. Once that's completed, then we will move to the construction phase where the community will see a lot of the work being done actually in the field. Again, projects often extend over multiple years, and so it can be difficult to understand what phase of the project a project is in. But by providing a capital improvement plan that breaks projects up over these phases and over the years of the plan, we hope to communicate better the way the projects are actually implemented. Another important factor of the budgeting and allocation phase is that once we have the capital plan developed and approved by the commission, we then also have to allocate money in each calendar budget year. Now, for example, in one project, we might have to allocate a specific amount, especially if we are going to be using cash financing to implement the project. So for example, if we have a $500,000 project and we have enough money in the bank to do that project, we have to budget that money in our annual budget so that we have the budget authority to actually spend the $500,000. Then we can then proceed with that project as planned. In the case of a project where we're going to be issuing bonds, what we'll often do is we will issue temporary notes that will give us short-term financing. We will then do the project, and then once it's completed, we will roll the temporary notes into the long-term bonds. The important thing is that we budget those dollars so that we have the budgetary capacity and authority to spend those dollars so that we don't violate state budget laws. Once a project is budgeted in an annual calendar year, we're then ready to move forward with that phase of the project. Whether it be design, construction, or even utility relocation, we are ready to proceed at that point in time. That brings us to our next project phase, which is the implementation phase. Now, as I've already mentioned, a project can extend over several years determined by its phase that we're in. Some projects can fit into one calendar year, but oftentimes they overlap calendar years. So during the implementation phase, it might be that we are going to be relocating utilities and or doing design work, and then in the next year we'll be doing construction. Implementation includes all of this work, and once a project has been authorized to move forward, we're going to be implementing it as part of that effort. Again, implementation can undergo several years and have different phases involved, but the important thing to note is that work is always being done on that project. As the project nears completion, we then transition to our last phase, which is the evaluation phase. And in this phase, staff is going to be evaluating not only the overall project, was it built correctly, was it done correctly, did we follow the processes and procedures, but we're also going to be evaluating the entire process to jumpstart next year's or the next planning process. Capital planning never ends in the city. We're constantly thinking about new projects and evaluating opportunities to allocate public resources. The needs of public infrastructure never end, as public infrastructure is continuing to age and in many cases deteriorate, and we need to reinvest dollars to keep the system working as best as we can for our community. By evaluating not only projects and how they're implemented, but also evaluating existing community needs, we're able to provide the best return on taxpayers' dollars. Well, that's basically the process, very briefly, but that's the process that we follow for capital project planning. And again, it allows us to look at all of the needs in the community and try to prioritize those needs and ultimately allocate funds so that we can invest in the best interests of the community. It's not an easy task, as there are always more needs than there are dollars. And the fact of the matter is, the amount of taxes and utility fees that would be needed to meet the current needs would be so large as to be insurmountable for the taxpayer and utility rate customer. That's why it's so important for the city to evaluate these projects, justify them thoroughly, and then invest them in the best manner that meets the highest and best needs of the community. Well, that's all we have for this episode. We'll see you next time on Citizens Academy.